Okay, hi everybody. This is going to be your first flipped classroom video for AP Environmental Science. This is section 1.1 in your course exam description. We're going to be talking about ecosystems, introducing what they are and how living and non-living things interact and how they affect each other. So the first thing we need to think about when we're thinking about ecosystems are these different levels of organization in which we can look at the living and non-living things in an area. So ecosystems are kind of smack dab in the middle of these different levels of organization. The most simple level of organization is the individual. So for example, one elk, which we have in this bottom left corner right here, an individual is just one organism, one living thing. The next level up is a population, and a population is a group of individuals in the same species. So for example, we have all of these elk that live in the same area. So that's our population of elk. Then next we have a community. That's the next level of organization. That's a little bit more complex than a population. This is all the biotic things. And let me remind you, biotic equals living. So all the living components of an area. So in this community right here, we have moose, we have maybe a bobcat, we have an owl, other organisms, and we also have trees, other plants. So these are all living things living in the same community or a part of the same community. Then we get to our ecosystem level. Our ecosystem is all the biotic living and the abiotic non-living components of an area. So this includes how many nutrients are available. So how many plants can live there depending on how many nutrients are available to them. Also, how much rainfall do we get? How much water is accessible to these living organisms and other things like that. Then after our ecosystem, we have our biome. We're going to talk a lot about biomes in the next two sections, but a biome is all the plants and animals found in a given region, and this is determined by climate. So climate is the average weather over time, so it's the average temperatures of an area and the average rainfall. The biggest section that we don't really need to define that much, but it's the biosphere. This is just the area of Earth that can support living things. Next, we're going to focus specifically in on ecosystems. And again, ecosystems are the topic of this entire unit. So ecosystems are particular locations on Earth, and they have non-living and living components, so biotic and abiotic components that interact together. Those biotic components can be species of plants, they can be animals, they can also be fungi and things as small as bacteria. Anything that we can classify as a living thing is a biotic component. And then we also have our abiotic components, which are the range of temperatures, the humidity of an area, the rainfall, and the nutrient levels. There are other abiotic components, but these are the main ones that we are concerned about. And the characteristics of these different ecosystems are dependent on the climate. So again, the climate is the average weather that an area experiences over time, average temperature, average precipitation. So these two examples, Death Valley up here on the top and Antarctica, these are two very different ecosystems, and they are going to support different living things. So we have different abiotic components. In Death Valley, it's super hot and it's not very humid. There's not a lot of rainfall. So we have different organisms that are rather hardy, that don't require a lot of nutrients and can store water for a long time that can live in this area. In Antarctica, we have higher levels of precipitation and very cold temperatures. So we have to have living things that can withstand those really intense cold temperatures. So when we're thinking about ecosystems, they can be divided in a few different ways. First off, some ecosystems can have really well-defined boundaries, and these are things like caves and lakes. If we look at this image on the upper left, the very entrance of a cave, that's just called the entrance zone, we get a lot of sunlight that can still enter this cave, so we can support photosynthetic plants. So this zone is the zone where we have lots of sunlight, we have green plants, and then those plants can then support other living organisms, other herbivores, support other predators, things like that. But as we move deeper into the cave, we move towards this twilight zone. When we are levels of light are decreased, we have less kind of fluctuations in temperature based on whether it's sunny or nighttime. So less temperature change, and there's low light, so there's a lot fewer plants, minimal plant life. And then as you move very deep into a cave, when you get to the dark zone, this zone is under constantly the same temperature, same humidity. It's usually pretty humid in there, and we cannot support any photosynthetic life. So this ecosystem, this cave ecosystem, has also several zones that are really well defined within it. Ecosystems can also have subjective boundaries. Yellowstone National Park is a really great example of this. Within the park, we can have different ecosystems that are divided by people with different interests. So for example, scientists can divide Yellowstone into animal ranges. That's what we see in this image on the right. This kind of lighter orangey tan colored range kind of goes throughout the upper part of the park. This is the fall winter range of bison. So scientists are interested in what these bison are doing in fall and winter, and this is an ecosystem that they're looking at, the interactions between bison and their environment and the abiotic factors there as well. They can also look at topographical features. So this Lamar Valley, this could be a smaller ecosystem within Yellowstone National Park. We're just looking at organisms that live within that valley. And then things like parks are often, their boundaries are often determined by individuals for political reasons. So if we look at Yellowstone, no ecosystem is really going to have this straight of a boundary right here. It's been determined by people that this is an area that we want to preserve. So for whatever reason, even though bison move out of Yellowstone into this other area in the fall and winter, that's not a part of our national park because that's been determined by our government that that's not part of the area that we are preserving. So a key part of ecosystems is community interactions, and these are interactions among different species or different organisms that live in that same ecosystem. So the first one is competition. This is the struggle of individuals over a shared limiting resource. These can be individuals that are the same species or individuals that are different species. And this is a negative relationship. It is harmful to both organisms because they are wasting energy having to fight each other or find new territory or things like that. Competition harms both organisms who are involved. And these limiting resources that they are looking at are things like food, or the things that they're competing over are things like food, water, could be mates, could be territory, and there's other limiting resources as well. Those are just some major ones. Our next interaction is predation. This is when one animal, the predator, kills another animal, the prey. So we've seen this a lot. I'm sure you know, you can think of a lot of examples of predation. And then we have symbiosis. And symbiosis is when two species live very close together. They have a long-term association with one another just because they live in the same area and they've lived together for a very long time. Symbiosis has three subsections that we're going to talk about. Mutualism is when both organisms benefit, so they're both positively impacted. This is often what we see with pollinators. So bees and flowers, hummingbirds and flowers. The bees receive nectar, hummingbirds receive nectar, and these flowers, their pollen gets collected on these bees' legs, gets stored in these kind of pollen sacs, and then moved from flower to flower, and that helps pollinate them. So they both benefit. Commensalism is a positive neutral relationship, so it's plus neutral. One species benefits, they get some good thing out of this relationship, and the other is neither helped nor harmed. So our example of commensalism is a tree frog and a tree. So the tree frog, it has this green color, so it can blend in with these leaves, where the tree will provide it some protection from potential predators, but the tree really doesn't get any benefit. It's not harmed, but it's not helped in this situation either. Then parasitism is a positive negative relationship. So one species benefits, the other is harmed. This is like mosquitoes and humans, for example. Mosquitoes get blood from us, which they need, and they can pass on really terrible diseases like West Nile virus, like malaria, that can be really harmful to people. In the next two slides, we're going to look a little bit more at competition in particular. So this principle, the competitive exclusion principle, is really important. And basically what it means is that two species who are competing for the same limiting resource cannot coexist. So if you have two organisms that are both vying for the same food type, they cannot coexist in the same area. So the graphs that you see are from a really famous experiment done to kind of come up with this principle. So this experiment was done with organisms called Paramecium. And Paramecium, they are single-celled aquatic eukaryotes. So they're single-celled aquatic eukaryotes. That's kind of a review from bio, but a eukaryote is a cell that's got organelles, membrane-bound organelles. It has chromosomes, DNA. It's much more complex than a prokaryote. And they're aquatic, so they're living in water. The two species that scientists were looking at were called P. aurelia and P. caudatum. So P. aurelia and P. caudatum. So these are two types of paramecium. This P at the front just stands for paramecium. They're two single-celled eukaryotes. The first of several experiments started with P. aurelia alone. It was left in a petri dish with food, and it was left there for about 30 days. And we can see that over 30 days, we have quite high population growth. So we're ending up at, between 350 and 400 cells. So it's been dividing, it's been reproducing in this environment. Also, in another petri dish, same conditions, same food type, we had P. caudatum alone, and we saw that these organisms were also growing. We don't have quite as many of them. They are ending up at the very end, they're around 130 cells. So there's fewer cells, but there's still that same rapid growth in these two organisms. But when you have both species grown together in this final experiment, what we see is P. aurelia has a very similar trend. So it still has high population growth, and P. caudatum kind of starts to grow and then levels off, and those numbers go back to zero. So that's because P. aurelia, as we could see in this first graph, we have way more cells that have divided, that have been formed in these petri dishes. So P. aurelia is just a much faster growing organism, faster to reproduce, and it's using up more of the food, not leaving enough for P. caudatum to reproduce. So that P. caudatum ended up completely dying by 35 days. So this is an example of that competitive exclusion principle, where we have two species competing for the same thing, but P. aurelia is a much better competitor, so it wins out in the end. All right, and then another thing that comes out of competition is called resource partitioning or partitioning. This is when different species that use the same resource use it in different ways in order to reduce competition. So the goal with partitioning, is to avoid competition at all costs. So we do not want to be competing, because competition, again, is a harmful relationship or a harmful interaction to both organisms, because they're having to waste a lot of energy that they could be using to hunt, or they could be using to find a mate, but they're using it instead to compete with some other organism that's really not going to benefit them. So resource partitioning is kind of the umbrella term, and then there are three types that we're going to look at. So first we have temporal partitioning. This has to do with different times. So wolves and coyotes will hunt at different times. night versus day, which is an example of temporal partitioning, but they live in the same area. They hunt the same things, they just hunt at different times. Then we also have spatial partitioning. This is when different areas of a shared habitat are used by different organisms. So this example, this image at the top shows a few different types of warblers. They live in the same types of pine trees, but this Blackburnian warbler kind of lives in these external areas. Our black-throated green warbler lives near the top, but kind of in the insides. So we have different areas that are utilized by these different warblers. This can also be considered when we're looking at plants. So if we've got soil, if this is soil right here, some plants will have really shallow roots that they'll use to get water and nutrients. And other plants will spend a lot of energy to create these really deep roots so they can get water and nutrients that are deeper in the soil. So those are both examples of spatial partitioning. Then we also have morphological partitioning, and this is when different resources are used based on different evolved body features. So an example of this would be if you've ever seen or been introduced to Darwin's finches. These finches have very different beak shapes, so they're morphologically different. Some finches have really big beaks that they can use to crush things like seeds with a shell or nuts, or they can also eat fruit with a pit. Whereas these other finches have really kind of narrow, thin beaks that they use much better to hunt for insects and other things like that. All right, then finally, within ecosystems, we have native species, and then we can also get exotic or invasive species. We're going to talk about this in detail in a later section, but just going to introduce it today. So a native species is a species that lives within its historical range, and it's highly adapted to that specific area. So it's lived there for a long time, it's developed adaptations that help it to survive within that area. So some examples are the slender salamander and the coastal redwood. Coastal redwoods are really cool because we have tons of coastal redwoods in Sonoma County. What they do is their needles are developed or adapted to utilize fog. Basically, fog will collect on their needles, and instead of these trees having to produce really deep roots to reach groundwater, what they do instead is these needles collect the water vapor in fog. It condenses and then it drips down onto their roots, and that's where they get the primary portion of water in order to survive. So coastal redwoods are really cool. And then within an ecosystem, we can also get exotic species. So these are species that are living outside of their historical range. So they're either introduced by people, they come in on some other organism, they move into a different range for some reason. But with these exotic species, a couple of different things can happen. They can either fail to establish a successful population, or they can rapidly increase in population size because they don't have natural predators in that area. So if a new species comes into an area and it's not well adapted to that area, there are predators that can easily catch it. It doesn't blend into its environment. Then it won't establish a successful population. It'll go extinct in that area pretty quickly. But if we have organisms that are that can do really well, can outcompete native organisms, then they will increase in population size rapidly. So some examples that we're worried about locally are zebra mussels. Well, zebra mussels are local. And then kudzu vine, which is primarily more in southern United States. But this is also really rampant. It spreads and grows really quickly and is super, super invasive. All right, so then for your first practice FRQ for this section, you're going to be looking at this food web. I want you to identify 2 organisms that are competing for a shared food resource. And then I want you to describe how resource partitioning could reduce the competition between the 2 specific organisms that you identified.